For our next exchange, I'm switching back to English because our guest is President of Media Matters for America. His name is Angelo Carusone, and he will be joining us on stage to talk about the anatomy of populist media. Angelo is going to speak a little bit by himself first and then be interviewed by our students. I would love for them to join us from the get-go. So Lucie Barsali and Laudine Storelli. Thank you. Angelo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to just speak very briefly, just sort of give a little bit of a sense of how I think about populist media in the United States, and then obviously we'll have a discussion. Just for context, so Media Matters is a media watchdog organization. We're a nonprofit. And part of this perspective is informed by what we do. So we're about 20 years old. Every year we live monitor, so that's in real time, radio, television, streaming services, and then we archive and analyze about 1.5 million more hours of programming on top of that, in addition to social media. So we have a pretty big perspective on the overall landscape, and a lot's changed in the States. So just a few things out of the gate that I would just note. One is that for decades we have had a massive right-wing media apparatus that has not necessarily been populist. And so part of what we're seeing right now is built on the foundation of a structure that existed for decades. For one piece of context, one of the talk radio hosts on the right, his name is Rush Limbaugh, this was the first presidential election in 30 years where Rush Limbaugh was not the single largest get-out-the-vote operation. And in terms of impact and influence on the media apparatus, at the height of his influence, Rush Limbaugh had an audience of approximately 8% of Americans. Almost 1 in 10 Americans were listening to Rush Limbaugh. That was not necessarily populist. It was conservative, it was Republican, it was in many ways authoritarian, it had populist overtones, especially when it came to being anti-immigrant and some of the racism, but it wasn't populist. But one of the things that's happened, and that's sort of what I'm going to get into, is that those large right-wing media apparatus that has existed, the combination of Fox News and talk radio, has basically been hijacked by populist media. So now, we were having this discussion a decade ago. I would have been very intentional to talk about right-wing media, conservative media, and populist media as separate entities and occasionally overlapping. Now I cannot. They are one and the same. They have been fully aligned in this moment. And there's a chart at the end that I think will illustrate just how powerful an effect that has had on the landscape, because it's essentially snuffed out whatever little bit of left-wing populism existed. And then the other two things, just quickly, is that we're in the early days. I think one of the things that people in the States in particular think is that this is over. This is the end. This is now the new normal, and it's not. It's actually getting worse. The trend is intensifying and increasing, and that's what I want to sort of get into. Instead of sort of getting up here and talking about all the different media properties that make this up, in many ways, that doesn't matter anymore. One of the ways that we think about the media landscape is by audiences instead, because audiences can be tapped into by new properties. They can increasingly then connect to social media influencers and how people get content one-to-one. So audiences really matter even more than individual media outlets. And so this is, I would say, in a period of time before 2017, 2018. And obviously, right-wing media, traditional right-wing media, Fox News would be in the black, Rush Limbaugh, talk radio would be there as well. And then you had these pockets of other media properties that kind of existed separately and apart, but had a little bit of overlap. Issue-centric, so there's an entire media ecosystem in the States that's just focused on guns. Literally, the National Rifle Association had its own media channels that had millions of subscribers that just talked about gun culture. White genocide, which was sort of the beginnings of this great replacement sort of emergence into traditional politics, but this idea that Democrats and liberals and the elites were replacing white Americans with immigrants. That was separate. There was a little bit of overlap with traditional right-wing media, but it wasn't completely there. The manosphere, which now everybody sort of talks about and knows about, it's like Joe Rogan and these other sort of bro podcasters that had emerged. And then the conspiracists, so people like Alex Jones and others. There was a little bit of overlap, but they all sort of existed separate. Their audiences were separate. There wasn't a ton of cross-pollination. They didn't sort of connect. And then you had these other places that were totally separate. The gaming community was significant. obviously the wellness community. This is what I would say it looks like now. And the big shift, and that's what I think is the one universal constant that applies no matter where you're looking at populist media now, is what's happening with audiences and the shifts. Anytime there's cross-pollination with audiences, or when a figure, a public figure, a media figure, a political figure, is able to tap into these disparate audiences and begin to bridge the divide, they're going to get a lot of power and it's going to escalate and intensify. And one of the things that Trump did, and this is very much about Trump, is that in the period leading up to 2017, when he first took office, and then in his first administration, and then more recently, he very purposely was taking content from these individual audiences, these individual communities, and mentioning them and sort of referencing them. The national media didn't really see why that mattered, but it mattered a lot when it came to building an audience, because he was beginning to connect these otherwise disconnected audiences. And then two other big factors happened. One was COVID. And COVID created a massive opportunity for the wellness community to overlap with a bunch of existing populist channels and conspiracists. And that just sort of moved it into sort of traditional right-wing media. One of the effects of the right-wing media being so big is that it was a center of gravity. And so that became an anchor and a foundation for these audiences to connect. And then the other effect is that the manosphere, the sort of the bro podcast sort of grew in size. And I mention that because one of the consequences of it being so big and significant is that it's had this gravitational effect on a whole bunch of other content, and that is this emergence of tradwives, this notion that women should go back into the home, that's a healthier place for it. This community that's growing online is huge. It's enormous, and it's not just propelled by individuals that are trying to connect and tap into the sort of the manosphere podcast. It also is tied into sort of this larger evangelical community. But that's, instead of getting into the specific outlets, this is, if I were to give a snapshot of what our landscape looks like right now, it's this. And they are increasingly merging more and more into the traditional political and right-wing media. If you notice, what I didn't put up here is national news, journalism, real news. It's really small right now. Practically insignificant, at least in the States. 75% of all cable news viewers are watching Fox News in this moment. That number is ticking up. It'll probably be close to 80% in a month, 85% shortly thereafter. In 3 months from now, they'll probably have about a 90% market saturation for all cable viewers. Those numbers get even worse when you look at local media and other national media and news properties. So they don't have a huge effect on the larger conversation of the culture right now. They matter in a lot of other ways, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. But when it comes to the audience and how that intersects with populist media, this is what's happening. The traditional right-wing media is being consumed by this populist narrative, and that's the last thing I'll just show before I get into some charts, is just like, what does it mean? And basically, our populism is both. It's economic and cultural. So you have basically strange bedfellows. You have people that are in for the economics, then because they're really mad at sort of corporate power. You have people that are in it because they really hate trans people and they feel like their culture is being taken away from them. And one of the things that populist media and this narrative is providing is that there is a single big bad for it, and that is liberals. It's sort of this elite. It's a deep state. So there's members of government that are out there that have been secretly sort of working behind the scenes to sort of engineer all of this. The other characteristics of it is that they're bloodthirsty. Our populist media is bloodthirsty. They want revenge. They want trials. They want punishment. They want retribution for someone. They want people to go to jail. They want people to be punished. They don't care who. They just want people to be held responsible. The bloodthirst is universal across all the audience segments. Everybody has a burning appetite for some type of consequence. The other thing that I would just notice, obviously, they're vigorously anti-establishment, doesn't matter what. The fourth part that I think is really significant, they're all narrative oriented. They're really good storytellers. No matter which segment that's there, they have a really good story. And part of the thing that is converging, at least in our populist media, is that the villain in the story is beginning to unify. They're centering around a central villain. In this case, the anti-immigrant sentiment, the culture wars, they each have a different sort of person or entity that they're mad at, immigrants or trans people. But right now, it's this, what is this known, at least in the States, is known as this deep state. So basically, government bureaucrats, people that work for the government, that have been there for decades. That is really what they're centering on as the big bad. And part of the reason that the story is sort of centering around it is that they say they're doing this so that they can entrench their power, that they are relying on their credentials as a way to sort of implement that authority, and that they're replacing traditional Americans sort of, with immigrants in order to solidify their power and entrench it for decades to come, which is why there's this migrant crisis. And then the last thing is just an ends justify the means attitude, that nothing matters. So before we get into the question, I'm just going to show some pictures. So this is just some examples of asymmetry between the right and the left. These are all populist programming these days, or populist aligned. There's only two that I would say are left-leaning in the top 10 podcasts by monthly listeners. It's incredible. And I'll share these charts later. This is another example. This is just total subscribers. If you wanted to just look at the universe of populist media, if you look at all 4 platforms, when we coded the major programs across all 4 platforms, the right are explicitly political or sort of adjacent to politics, and then on the left you see sort of the liberal or left aligned. This is a bigger example. This is just monthly podcasts by listeners, by monthly listens. So these are people that may not even be subscribing, that just sort of get it, oh, hey, you like this other show, you should maybe take a listen to this new thing. The imbalance is substantial, extreme. And then this is the last thing I'll show is just to give I think the bubble thing shows a better example of what happens day to day. So these are populist programming or populist aligned programming increasingly. This is conservative. This is just looking at YouTube. This is left-leaning. 2 of these figures here one of them is not even named because their number is so small they didn't even fit there, but the Young Turks would be an example of liberal populism. They sort of emerged in the 2010s as explicitly anti-corporate, explicitly on an economic agenda. They're the largest sort of stream there. And then this is what happens when you combine them. So if you're just a typical consumer and you're on YouTube, that's what the universe looks like for you. You just get drowned out. And that's when I was sort of talking before about how the audiences are converging, how people get lost in these narratives. If you have an entire media ecosystem, regardless of who they talk to, that are really good at narratives, really good at storytelling, and then you have these other sort of disparate audiences that are engaged. There's a lot of kinetic energy, but they're just focused on their thing. I'm focused on wellness. I'm focused on conspiracies. I sort of like these sort of like podcasts that are more in the manosphere space. One of the consequences that happens when those audiences have a chance to cross-pollinate is they grow really fast. In part because you could have political figures that exploit it, and in part because the way the social media algorithms work, if you have one audience member that likes something from a different piece of content, they'll start being served or recommended that more and more and more. And so one of the byproducts, and this sort of ties in with what I was saying at the beginning, is that we're at sort of the beginning of this curve, not the end, is that the more these audiences cross-pollinate and converge, the faster those audiences will grow, and that narrative will take over and dominate. And I'll just give one example like this. I think this is sort of the thing that, when I say it at the beginning, that we see the field and we can sort of see what's coming around the bend. In 2017 and 2018, we used to talk about this conspiracy theory called QAnon, which is this idea that there's this secretive cabal and Trump had this big plan and that he was going to arrest all these people. It was just so this pro-Trump conspiracy. And that largely Democrats and liberals were basically vampires that were engaging in child sex trafficking to sort of sustain their lives. People thought I was crazy. And now QAnon is like a standard, commonly accepted thing. So the reason I mention that is that if I were to say what's the consequence of narratives and how these audiences cross-pollinate and where it goes, if you just look at where the trend lines are going, demon hunting will be a significant consequence and problem and factor in our populist narratives and in our politics, probably within a year, maybe less than that. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if within the first 2 years of Trump's new administration, he launches a demon hunting task force. And why do I say that? Because I look at what's happening. I look at where the audiences cross-pollinate. where the growth is, where the trend line is. And the more you sort of push this populist narrative that it's not just liberals that are driving this agenda, but you look at where the audiences are cross-pollinating, increasingly the idea that there are demons among us is popping up in all those different audience segments, bit by bit, and a demand for the government to do something about it or in response to it. So I sort of close on that sort of weird note because I think it sort of ties together the fact that the audiences are really key here, not so much the structures, and that the cross-pollination. Anytime you have moments where somebody is either speaking to or an algorithm is pushing audiences that are separate, but maybe being able to connect them, you have a real problem, and that's where I think the warning signs, that's where we tend to focus our sort of efforts. So with that, I'll sort of have some questions.
Dear Angelo Carusone, thank you for being with us. You're an American author and media advocate. You lead Media Matters, a non-profit media watchdog, which aims to demonstrate the overrepresentation of conservative politicians and journalists in terms of airtime and media space. You also led political and progressive initiatives such as Thème, which you launched in 2012 already. So our first question is about Donald Trump. How could his re-election threaten freedom of press?
One of the things that's sort of different this time than last time is that Trump still needed the press in 2017. So they could antagonize the media. You could sort of bully them. It was a much more traditional way of working the refs, complaining about coverage so you get better coverage, or appealing to your base by attacking the media, or going after their credibility so that you could then present yourself as the only credible source, or maybe identify other credible sources, like say, he would attack CNN or he would attack the New York Times so that he could encourage more people to pay attention to Fox News. What's different this time is, one, I would not have described, there were populist parts of Trump in the first time around, but he was still operating in a pretty traditional framework of the right-wing echo chamber. What's different now is that because that right-wing media is fully populist, they will not accept anything less than full-on retribution and attacks against the news media. So what does that mean? It means a few things. One, harassments, so legal investigations. Two, it means threats, which of course you want to stifle speech. Three, and we've already seen this, is lawsuits. I mean, he's suing CBS for $10 billion. In a court in Texas, which has lots of consequences there potentially. Even if they are successful, which I think they will be, they'll spend a fortune. And if you're in a newsroom and maybe you're not really one of the big players, you have to decide if writing an article is going to be worth it. Is it worth publishing this one piece or this one story if I'm going to have to spend potentially 3 months of budget in order to defend a litigation? So I think what we'll see is not just a lot more rhetoric, but a combination of explicit harassment, legal harassment, and then an increase in litigation and lawsuits. It's unclear if there will be a prosecution or not. I don't think that'll be the first thing out of the gate. I think it'll be much more in the realm of investigations.
Thank you. And still on the topic of Trump, we know that he appointed Elon Musk in his government. And we were wondering, because you already had to face Elon Musk, because you he filed a lawsuit against you against Media Matters, over research highlighting anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi content on X. So can you explain a bit the situation, and how do you think it's a risk having him in the government?
Yeah, I think it ties in with this larger consequence of chilling of speech and attacks on the media as well. Few people hate the press more, and when I say press, I really mean journalists, as much as Donald Trump, except for maybe Elon Musk. And one of the things that he did to Media Matters, and he's suing me personally as well as the individual reporter that wrote these articles, is that there were just some reports that showed that the tool that they claimed existed that was supposed to keep extreme content from not running, ads from not running alongside extreme content wasn't working as they claimed. So we had found a whole bunch of Hitler enthusiasm content or pro-Nazi content, and then there was ads running alongside it. So we published some pretty standard reports around that. In response to that, we received lawsuits in Texas, as well as in Ireland, Singapore, and then he used his public platform to pressure state attorney generals to launch investigations into Media Matters. So it was a full-on legal assault, and I think it is a lesson for not just where Musk is going to sort of how he's going to play, but I think what they were writing was a new playbook for how they go after news media. I don't think it's a coincidence that when Donald Trump sued CBS, he sued them in the same district in Texas that Elon Musk is suing Media Matters. I think what they're doing is writing a new playbook for how they sort of bring the media to heel. And so what do I think the consequence is? If he's in his ear all the time and he's also willing to fund some of these lawsuits or pay for them, that just ratchets up the pressure. And that's what we've seen in sort of soft authoritarianism or emerging authoritarianism across the world, is that you have outside players, allies of sort of the leader, either buying up media properties or using their resources to break or subdue what would be controversial media properties. And I would just, as an example, we are really hated in the United States by the right wing. I mean, just truly, they despise, they hate Media Matters. But I mean, in the days before the election, Elon Musk talked about two things: Donald Trump and Media Matters. I mean, he was still ripping us apart publicly. And I think it's an example of not just how the litigations will play in, but then a recognition that raising the stakes and going after these entities publicly could potentially make them toxic and then harder to do their jobs. And I think that's going to be a part of the strategy. So I think it just makes it much more likely that we see all the scary things that people are worried about happening to the press actually come to fruition.
Should the media move from X to blue sky? I'm probably legally prohibited from making recommendations like that. What I would say is that it is good practice in this landscape to go where people are, and blue sky is emerging as an influential player. So one, I think media have to start to recognize that you have to follow audiences, and blue sky is significant. Two, I don't know how it'll apply outside of the States, but in the States, X has defined where all litigation will take place going forward. So they've picked a court that he thinks is good for him, and so that means that if you are on a media outlet or a reporter and you're on X and you get sued, it will be in a district or a court that might not be favorable to you. So I think that should be a consideration as well. And I think that's what's different. I really want to emphasize that. We are a watchdog, so most of our staff is research, but we do have reporters. We have investigative reporters on staff. It's not just Media Matters that got sued. It was the individual journalist that got sued as well, personally. I expected to be sued. I shouldn't have been, but I understand why they sued me. I run the place, but suing the reporter is a big deal. And so if you're on X or you're on a platform and you could potentially, if that opens up a vector of attack for you, it's a vulnerability. And I would just say that everyone should be careful to not create additional layers of exposure, but then also, just as good practice, to follow as many audiences as you can. Could you a bit elaborate on your work? You perceive it as watchdog journalism. Can you explain what it is?
Yeah, I mean, I wish Media Matters didn't need to exist, to be honest, for two reasons. One is that the way we got started is in the 90s, one of the things that conservatives did is they invested in building their own media properties. And their strategy was that if you wanted to engage in political attacks, or really effective political attacks, that you prop up what looked like news outlets. I mean, believe it or not, there was a recognition that you needed to be a news outlet to have a political or persuasive effect, and so they stood up a whole bunch of conservative newspapers that had a veneer of journalism that they could then publish articles. A lot of them were bogus, but they had a veneer of journalism still. And then obviously talk radio, that's how Fox News came to be. They were sort of the tail end of this massive investment. And one of the things that happened is that you then have this massive right-wing media apparatus that's out there attacking newsrooms every day as liberal, as liberal, as liberal. You work the refs, and it started to shift our coverage across the board. Newsrooms or journalists would say, well, I don't want to be perceived as liberal, so in order to inoculate myself from that attack, I might sort of privilege or at least give credence to some of these sort of either fringe perspectives or far-right perspectives. It started to have an effect both in newsrooms and in our politics. And so what Media Matters was born out of was this idea that this conservative media apparatus was so big that it was having a distorting effect on newsrooms. And we were there to sort of balance the scales. So the reason I say I wish we didn't exist is, one, I wish that didn't happen. I wish either that there was a counter. I think it'd be fine if you have a conservative media, if you had a similar liberal media that was robust, and that's how people argue, and great. The other thing is that newsrooms started to get rid of their ombudsmen and public editors, which would have been the sort of internal watchdogs. And the more newspapers got rid of that role, the worse it got. And there wasn't really an outlet to say, wait a minute, we've written 100 stories about this topic, but not any about that topic, or all of our news articles on this topic have not quoted anyone that's affected by it, or have been disproportionately conservative or disproportionately liberal. Those roles basically evaporated. So Media Matters basically was born out of necessity. And that's what we do. We do a lot of data and study and tracking, and we are a resource for journalists that are doing reporting these days, and then we sort of do a little bit of our own reporting.
Thank you. I think now we have to open to the public the questions.
Yeah, actually we're running a little bit behind, so we're gonna jump right into the next panel, but I do want to thank Angelo Carusone and our students for the questions. Thank you.